We are live.
Thank you and good afternoon and welcome to today's meeting. Today is January 12th, 2023. AIB meeting is now live. Let me first of all thank all of you for joining us today. A couple of opening comments, just a second, but I want to make sure that we have an appropriate quorum. So why don't we indicate who's here at this point in time, Rachel? Who's on, Rachel?
Mr. Chair, I think Rachel had to step away. I can just call roll very quickly. Mr. Manco is present.
Yes, here.
Dr. Stapleton?
Here.
Okay. Dr. Lynch?
Here.
Dr. Doss?
Here.
Okay. And those are the members that are present today. That constitutes a quorum, Mr. Chair. So the rest of your members are either absent or will be joining us shortly.
Thank you.
We just now have Dr. Kerwin joining us.
Apologies, folks. I did miss your email.
No problem. First of all, Happy New Year to everyone and welcome back. I hope that you had a very productive holiday season. We have been busy at work finishing the details of the plan, getting it posted, and we've had a great deal of comments and outreach and engagement with the public as it relates to that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Let me acknowledge and thank Rachel and her staff. Joe mentioned a moment ago that we are moving towards making sure that we can hire our full complement of 15 people. But in the interim, we've had essentially 4 staff members working. And when you look at the volume of work, the productivity, the quality and the quantity overall, it has been remarkable. I have heard a great deal from many who question whether or not we could get the initial comprehensive plan out at the time that we've indicated, and we've done so. A great deal of thanks go to Rachel, her staff, as well as all the other entities that we've worked with, the state board and others who've helped along the way, Dr. Chaudhry and his team. All of those people have been instrumental. But I want to especially thank and acknowledge Rachel's hard work. She was working through the holidays, through the weekends, and a great deal of other time that is remarkable, an entire staff. So thank you for all of the work. We are going to go through our agenda in the following order. We have our proposed bylaws, hiring processes, and one other item associated with that is the staffing plan as well. I've indicated to Rachel a few moments ago that we should post that so that people would know that, especially as it relates to the time and of trying to get everybody on board. For those of you who do not know, it is a very difficult and cumbersome process throughout the state to really get all of your people hired at the time that you want. And that's why it is so remarkable that we've been able to get so much done without having anywhere near the entire complement of people. So what I want to do at this time, Rachel, is to go now to the proposed bylaws and hiring processes. And hopefully we can, if everyone is prepared today, take a vote and simply adopt those. But I'm going to turn that over to Britt, and you work with the committee and chair that process to bring us to the point of hopefully adopting these today. So Britt, I'm going to turn it over to you as it relates.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Ike. And you asked that I work with Laura and yes, unfortunately he has departed. So, but he was involved in the early part of the discussion. We had, I think, an extended meeting with Heidi, and she was, and Heidi, I think at one meeting you even, you had one of your colleagues.
Britt, you need to who Heidi is, because I'm not sure everybody knows.
Oh, Heidi is our interim general counsel. Heidi's on the call, I believe.
I am. I'm here, Mr. Vice Chair. Heidi
Yeah.
Dutterer.
Yeah. Yes. And so Heidi and your colleague, I forget the gentleman, I forget his name.
Alan Dunklow.
Alan Dunslow. Yeah. So we had several very productive conversations with them. They went off and based on those conversations and their own expertise, brought a draft of the bylaws. And we then had a chance to iterate on it, make some changes, make some suggestions for modifications, which were mostly accommodated. And so that led to this product that we have before us today. And I think, Mr. Chairman, it might be useful just to put it up if we can and go through it and see if people have any questions or any things they would like to see changed in it. I know Laura has sent an email or has a number of, I think, relatively minor, but several issues she wants us to consider as we do go through it. So why don't we just start, if that's okay, to start through the bylaws. And Rachel, are you going to move this along?
Actually, Heidi is.
Okay, Heidi, you might give just an overview of the structure as we get into it, and then we can go through the various articles and see what comments people have.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. For the record, Heidi Dutterer, Assistant Attorney General, and temporarily assigned to the AIB for counsel. Just a couple of quick notes about bylaws that are used for state boards and commissions. Generally speaking, bylaws are used to define those relationships between and among the board members and the staff. We typically don't include sort of very specific detail about how the day-to-day operations of the agency are going to be run. That's something that would be discussed with the chair or the vice chair or the executive director. Those are things that would be left to them. So the goal of these bylaws essentially is to ensure that you have some framework for parliamentary procedure, including quorum. Your quorum is actually set forth in your statute, but we've reiterated it within the bylaws. And also just how you all will interact with the staff. So you can see in the table of contents that's on the screen before you that we have various articles and sections, and we can proceed through those. Graham, if you could go to the first page, which is actually page 2 of the bylaws. So the next page. Okay, so in section 1.1, I will also, I do want to say preliminarily that as we go through this discussion, if you all, this draft has been posted online. So at this point, if you all would like to, if one of you would like to see a change made within this draft, a motion should be made. Discussion would then be had on that motion, and then it can be seconded or tabled, however you want to handle that. But that's how we would need to proceed at this point. This draft is the draft that we're working from. So our first section, 1.1, is your definition section. These are the terms that we felt needed to be defined within the bylaws. So we've got board, executive director, member, and quorum. Your quorum is, just to point out, it's a majority of the members currently serving on the board. So vacancies don't affect that quorum. Okay, section 1.2 is
Heidi, on that point, I mean, we're 7-member board. So if we lose one, so it means 4 people are required for a majority.
Correct.
If all are present.
Correct. I mean, so that's for your current 6. Yes, 4 would be well, required.
Even if we had 7, it would still be 4, right? So in other words, what you're saying is it still takes 4 votes.
It does.
To approve anything. to take
It does.
action.
And we'll get further down. I think one of your members had a question about the board taking action and what is required. I'm not sure that we specifically laid that out in these bylaws, but action by the board does require an affirmative vote of a majority of the then appointed members. So right now you have 6 appointed members. You would need to have
4 votes.
any action that's taken would have to be taken by a majority of that 6, which would be 4.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving down, if there are no questions in definitions, section 1.2, the purpose. I should also step back again and say that we modeled these bylaws off of the bylaws that have been enacted and used by the Maryland Longitudinal Data System for some time. And so this purpose statement is verbatim from their purpose statement. It's pretty general. It just says that it's your rules of governance for your meetings and conducting all of your duties under state law. Okay, section 1.3 is your enactment section. So the bylaws have to be approved by a majority vote of the board, as do amendments. If someone wants to amend the bylaws, even after they're adopted, that you would need to make a motion and then present that amendment during a regularly scheduled meeting of the board. And then an amendment, just like the bylaws, would have to be approved by a majority vote of the board. Your annual meeting, we've set the annual meeting to be the August meeting each year, and the bylaws would need to be reviewed by the board at that meeting, just to see if any changes were needed at that time. And a member can make a motion, during one of those regularly scheduled meetings at any time. If we can scroll down to section 1.4, I'm sorry, section 2.1. The last part of that was that the approved bylaws and any amendments that have been approved will be available for public inspection. So in the same way that you would post.
I think, Joe, do you have a question?
I'm so sorry. I didn't see that, Mr. Manko.
Yeah.
My question is on section 2.1. So I just continue, Heidi, and then I can ask it afterwards.
Sure. And then in Article 2, this is the organization of the board. Your membership and your terms are set forth in statute. So we just made citation to those sections of statute. Did you have a question here, Mr.
Can I go
Manko?
back? I'm sorry, I missed something. I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with putting the date of the annual meeting as opposed to, certainly we'll have an annual meeting. But I think that there are some things that we need to do as a board each year, and they may reflect a different time frame, and or meetings for an annual meeting in August sometimes is challengeable. Is there any way we have flexibility in terms of when that meeting is to be held? So that I don't want to have in statute that we can only have an annual meeting in August, when there may be a challenge or difficulties that we may have to adjust. That does this provide for that flexibility?
From a legal perspective, I don't think there would be a problem with that. I think Rachel might have some thoughts on administratively how that would work.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think August was selected because that's when the board has to adopt the updated comprehensive plan by August 1st each year. And it's also sort of the time when budget requests start to be due. So from the flow of the board's work, August might be a good time for that. The other thing I just want to point out is that the term of the vice chair is tied to when the annual meeting is. Yeah,
but let me go back to the second. I know that, and I know there's a reason why we want to have it listed, want to have it in August. The difference is that this says precisely August. And I don't want to have us in a situation where, because of August, vacations, a whole lot of other things going on, that changes and we say we can't do it because it is listed in August. I would simply say that bylaws should be reviewed at the board's annual meeting. And why say August if we don't have to?
I think that the point that Rachel was making, I understand in this section, that makes a lot of sense. I think for the election of the vice chair, we've said that it's a 2-year term. And so if you get too far away from sort of that,
I understand.
we could
But-
say maybe, within a certain time period.
Could
of the
I,
year.
could
I
I
don't know,
just
we have to-
offer that maybe, I think what I'm hearing the chair saying is that the summer may offer some challenges with vacations. Like, would it perhaps just be a suggestion to just change the annual date to September as an example?
No, we don't have to. My point is, I am hoping and believe that we can do August, especially with the early part of August. I simply do not think that it's necessary for us to put it in statute in our bylaws to say that it is August. Because once you get to September, you may have the same challenge at some point. The question is, you need to have an annual meeting with the intent that we'll try to have it in August. But you need to put flexibility there rather than have someone saying to us, you said in August, and August you did not have it. You had it at July the 31st or September the 1st. That to me doesn't make any sense. And we can work around elections and changes of officers and those kinds of things. But once you put in a precise date or time, then you chop yourself into that, I think.
I think we have to have a range, because otherwise, what's to say that my annual meeting isn't August this year and then July next year and then June, I think that there probably has to be a range so that it's consistent and because it is tied to the other things. But could we have something that's like, we'll have an annual meeting no earlier than July 31st, no later than September 30th or something?
Well, I think perhaps for the bylaws, for the writing of it, is it possible to just say, for example, we're looking at letter C, where it says the bylaws shall be reviewed by the members of the board on an annual basis at the board's annual meeting, period. Is it necessary?
I think, so one thing that I think is important to think about with bylaws is that we're not going to be able to include every detail here. So we can take out in August and then just commit, you all can commit as a board outside your bylaws, just as a body that you are going to have your annual meeting within a certain period of time. And that way, if it doesn't happen to be sometime between July 31st and September 1st or September, whatever, then you're not out of compliance with your bylaws. And if the annual meeting starts to drift too far away from where you as a body would like to see it, you can always revisit these bylaws if you'd like to. But I think having the maximum flexibility at this time is probably a good idea. And then moving towards something else if you deem it necessary at some later date.
I was wondering, and this may not work, if you said that annual meeting in the third quarter of each year. That would give you some flexibility. It would be July, August, or September. I don't know whether that makes sense or not, but.
Or each summer. I was thinking each summer, but if we don't need to even specify that, it might be better to have more flexibility. I think we might need to make a change with the vice chair's term, but we'll get to
But we
that.
can deal with that at that point in time.
Yeah.
And is to have it in August. I just don't want to be tied to that with absolutely no flexibility. That's all.
So
And
what
by
I'm hearing is we're going to delete in August here.
Yeah.
So
Everyone
I
agrees?
think we'll have to have a motion. Is that right, Heidi?
Yeah, so I can go ahead and just read a motion, and if someone would like to say so moved, that would be
Alright.
fine. So the motion is to amend the draft bylaws in, I believe that was section 1.3. 1.3C to remove in the phrase in August.
I'll so move.
Second. Any question or discussion on that issue? Hearing none. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 Opposition? Hearing none, motion carries.
Okay, very well. So we're down at section 2.1. Mr. Manko, was this the section that you had a question in?
Yeah, I had a couple questions, and I don't know if this is some of this is in statute already, so I don't know if it is beneficial to reiterate it here, but I was wondering if there should be information included in this section about board vacancies and the process of identifying new members, and perhaps discussing the role of the nominating committee, because it seemed like that it seemed like that was absent at this point in the bylaws. And then also just specifying that even though, if I understand correctly, even though the 7 members that are currently assigned are on staggered terms, that the terms moving forward are 5-year terms.
So one of the things that you all have pretty robust requirements in statute, and should any of those change at any point, which I would imagine that they wouldn't, but if they did, I just didn't want the bylaws to sort of lag behind. And so with making a cross-reference to the statute, was just to keep those in lockstep. The vacancies are, as you know, filled by the nominating board, which is also in statute. We could make a reference here, or further down in the bylaws, there's a section on resignations. We could add something there as well, if you'd like to have that same cross-reference to the section on the nominating board.
I mean, for me, it was, I think just for clarity, but, if this becomes cumbersome, then it's not, I think it's not necessary. It's clearly already enshrined in the statute, but, it seemed like important things to reiterate, just so that we had those items also in our bylaws. But I'm fine with it not being included if it's additional and unnecessary.
Okay, so if there's no further
Dr. Lynch.
So Heidi, I just have a question. So the section 2.1 is membership, which makes sense. And then lower down, we have something about resignations. We don't seem to have anything about removals, like should somebody need to be removed from the board or from any of the AIB, sort of positions. And I'm wondering, I don't know if it would be here or somewhere else, but I feel like we should probably flesh that out before we ever need to use it.
Right. So your statute doesn't have any removal authority in it. Just double check on that. And so without that removal authority, a removal would occur only, and you all are subject to advice and consent. So there's a process for removal, but it's not something that you all would determine. I think that there would have to be a recommendation, because the governor does the appointments, the recommendation by the governor to the Senate. But in any event, there's not, for members and the chair, who's selected by jointly by the governor and the presiding officers, there's not, the board does not, or the commission does not have the ability to select a method of removal or grounds for removal. In terms of staff, that your chair is responsible for hiring your executive director, and you all as a board could have that discussion. I mean, if you would like to put something in here, we could, but I don't know that that's something that we would have in the bylaws. It would be something that you all would discuss as a personnel matter.
Could I go back to one question on the chair? 2.2.
Mm-hmm.
What is meant by?
I think we haven't actually gotten to that yet.
Oh, I thought we had.
Okay.
Sorry.
And I did just want to, Mr. Manco, you asked about the terms for the board members. And I was just double checking that, but the terms of the AIB members are 6 years and the initial terms are staggered. I think you might have seen the terms of the nominating committee members are 5 years. So just to share that.
So in terms of Dr. Lynch, was there something specific that you were hoping to see or would like to see in regards to removal?
I just, it's one of those things that you hope you never ever have to use, but I feel like, if we're developing bylaws that whether it's, something that lays out whatever that process would be, like there would have to be a recommendation to the governor or something. And there's sort of 3 different layers. One is like, what would happen if there needed to be removal of a board member? What happened if there needed to be, or chair, because those are all appointed. What happens if there needed to be removal of a vice chair? What happens if there needs to be removal of the executive director or the executive director's staff? So, I don't know that it has to be in here or not, but I also feel like we should have some clarity so that should the worst ever come to bear, that we have some sort of guidance that we've established and we're making decisions outside of particulars.
So I can come back and give you all an overview of 4 members and officers other than the chair. Again, the chair is jointly appointed by the governor and the presiding officers, and only they would be able to remove the chair. I can come back and give you guidance on what the law provides for removal of members who are appointed by the governor with the advice and consent of the Senate. In terms of staff, the board hires the staff, including the executive director, and would be governed by state law and any personnel policies that are later developed by this board in terms of hiring, termination, discipline. I'm not sure that this is necessarily the place to do that. That might be better handled in a personnel policy that needs to be developed.
Maybe then, Heidi, maybe there's even just an addition here that just says in accordance with a personnel policy. And then we just develop it.
I like that suggestion.
You get that, Heidi?
I did. And so would you like to make that motion? I can state that motion. We're going to have to include, it's going to be state law and a personnel policy that, is developed in the future, because right now you all are following the personnel policies that are established by the Department of Budget and Management.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and make that motion then?
Okay. The motion, and we would like to put that, did you want to put that here in 2 points? This is a membership section. I'm thinking that we're not really talking about members here. We're talking about, we're really talking about staff, because membership, removing a member or the chair is going to be governed by state law. You have no autonomy in that area. Removal of your vice chair is something that you could have a discussion about later. And I think when we get down to, it wouldn't really be removal, it would be termination of personnel, would be down under a personnel section that we could add in. So do we want to handle those maybe as we get further along?
Why don't we get to that point? If we need to come back, why don't we put it in that appropriate section?
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So that's section 2.1. We can move to section 2.2. I know you had a question here, Mr. Chair.
What is meant by jointly?
So this is directly from your statute. I think that Rachel can probably advise on how that happened.
I know, but I'm saying, what do they state?
All three, they have to agree. They have to agree on the selection of the chair, all 3.
Yeah. But that's what I was asking. Does jointly mean that or jointly mean something else? Different from what this,
It just means agreement. So I think they typically maybe sign a letter or something that says.
no. In the statute, all three of them must unanimously agree.
Yep.
Yes.
Does all three of them unanimously agree mean the same as jointly?
Yeah, I
Yes.
believe that is exactly what the statute says, but I'll double check lower. I think it says shall jointly appoint.
Yeah, but I'm saying,
Yes.
I just make sure that the term jointly means the same as all three of them unanimously agree.
It does
Yes.
mean unanimously. Yes.
Yes.
All right.
And that is verbatim the language in the statute.
Okay, all right, that's all the question.
Okay. So that was A, and B, the duty of the chair. These are duties that I think for the most part we pulled directly from the MLDS bylaws. And these are very standard: conducting the board meetings and setting agendas, serving as the primary board member spokesperson for media inquiries. This is something I would like to note as just good process, making sure that that all communications come either from the chair or the chair's designee. Acting as the board's primary point of contact for the executive director. We'll get further down into section 5.3, but entering into contracts and agreements subject to the provisions of 5.3, and then appointing ad hoc committees as needed. So we haven't set forth specific committees here. As committee work is needed, the chair will establish those committees and appoint members. Moving down to were there any questions on this section? I don't see any hands raised. So moving down to section.
I do, because of the word ad hoc committees. What about standing committees?
I wasn't aware that you all had these standing
Well, we
committees.
don't, but I mean, does the chair have the authority
Yeah, we may.
to create a standing committee?
You can. We could revise this section for standing committees.
Okay.
I don't know if my colleagues think it's necessary, but we might have committees, and
So we will have committees. The question is whether or not we have, in addition to ad hoc committees, standing committees, which means that they are permanent ongoing
Right.
committees.
I would suggest that
We may do that at some point in time, and we just need to make sure that flexibility is there.
I would suggest that we leave room for once an ad hoc committee is created, over time, we decide whether that might have to turn into a standing committee, at which time we can revisit the bylaws at the next annual meeting and create that as a standing committee. So I don't think anything has to be done right now, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, that from a legal perspective, that would be an acceptable practice as well. Again, this gets back to, I mean, if you create a standing committee, you would probably want to name them in the bylaws and have, whatever their purpose and all of that would probably be laid out in your bylaws. So whether or not you give the chair the ability to create these standing committees now, or you do it at a later point, that's completely up to you.
And just for clarity, these are standing committees of the board, not, like, I'm just wondering how, like, the advisory committees fit into this, or the data work group that's being formed, like how that would all fit under this portion of the bylaws, or does that sit outside of?
This is only governing the relationship of the board members and the AIB staff.
Got it.
Okay, so it's not just as simple as saying appointing standing and ad hoc committees is needed at this point.
We can add standing in.
Okay,
So would you like to make that motion, Dr. Dawes? I can read it for you.
okay. I'd like to make a motion to include the word standing so that it is appointing standing and ad hoc committees is needed.
I'll second.
Okay, there's a motion on the floor. Any discussion?
Can I just ask a clarifying question? Because I think what I heard Heidi say just a minute ago was that if we put in standing, then we actually have to list the standing committees and their functions. Can
Would you say
we,
that-
can
yeah,
we
but you-
add that word
Yeah.
without that clarification?
Would you say it
We
as
don't
needed?
have any standing committees right now. What if
But it-
between now and the next time you do a bylaw amendment, you created a standing committee, you would probably want to amend your bylaws at that point, and include.
But the term says as needed, so that you can add or delete from that based on the will of the body at any point in time you want to. That would be correct?
Correct.
All right. Okay, so it's as needed, and we may come back at some later point and vote on establishing specific committees, standing committees, and we will determine that at the appropriate time we think that it is needed. All in favor of the motion, please indicate by aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Hearing none, the motion carries.
Okay, moving down to section 2.3, this is the section on vice chair. We will need, we will need a motion to remove August here. If you don't want to be tied to even a vote in August of each year.
Yeah.
So just
Annual meeting. So that means it could be August, could be later, could be July, but that's the intent of purpose here, to make it consistent.
okay, so for A, this the vice chair is elected from among your members by the full board. The election for vice chair shall occur when your annual meeting is every 2 years. Did we still want to have this first election in August of 2023?
No, just leave it as annual, I guess.
Okay.
That's the intent.
But it's not annual, it's every 2 years.
It's every,
Yeah.
yeah,
So I think
I
we
would think
should
it would be
specify
2024.
So this was discussed among the subcommittee, and I think that you all had planned or thought that there would be an election this August.
Heidi, could we say the election for vice chair shall occur during the board's annual meeting every 2 years beginning in 2023? And just
Sure.
take out the references to in August?
Sure.
each Place,
Sure.
would that work?
Can I also just get an understanding from either Heidi or from the committee, the rationale behind the not serving 2 consecutive terms?
That would need to,
Oh.
that answer would need to come from the subcommittee members.
I think it was so that, there was a chance for other members, giving everybody, more people a chance to move into a leadership position with the board.
Mhm.
And, I think if you don't do that, sometimes it just, things get locked in. And I think it's healthy to see some change and to bring other people into leadership positions. So that was at least my thinking for this provision.
That makes sense, but you're doing a great job, Britt.
And I think relatedly, my question is, a lot of times when you have these positions, there's also like serves no more than 3, or like there's term limits. I don't have any particular feelings about it, especially because in general, our positions are term limited. But I just wanted to kind of propose or ask the question of, does anybody feel like we need to have that for any particular reason?
I don't think we do. If we're limited by 6 years, the most anybody could serve would be 2 non-consecutive.
Just to clarify, You do have 6-year terms, but you can be reappointed.
If we accept that appointment.
Correct.
So, and the
It-
AIB is sort of, we're time limited in the statute, you know, so, I mean, I think that's the other element of it. But if it does end up being something that endures, then if you are theoretically appointed to 2 terms, that would be 12 years, you know, so to have somebody in a leadership position is really the entire trajectory of a child's educational experience. And so, I mean, I do want to sort of put it in that context of there may be something then to having term limits so that you don't have one set of leadership dominating, you know, and basically an entire cycle of an educational experience.
No, I think it's good to have this reference that we have here in section 2.3b, and just removing the specific August.
So just to, we'll finish up 2.3 and then I'll read a quick motion just to clean up that August reference. Just very quickly, the vice chair shall fulfill the roles and duties of the chair. If the chair can't be at a meeting or is unavailable to do so, the chair may also delegate duties to the vice chair. So that's, you know, in a separate thing. So if there are any other questions regarding section 2.3, the motion is to amend section 2.3 to remove all references to August.
Yeah. All right. Is there any further discussion on the motion? If not, there was a second to the motion.
Second.
Okay, moved and second that we make the changes from August to annual, otherwise the second remain as it is. Here, no further discussion. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Any opposition? Here, no opposition, the ayes have it. So, Heidi?
Thank you. If we could scroll down to section 3.1, we're in Article 3 meetings.
Heidi, can I just interrupt for just 1 minute? I'm
Sure.
sorry, but before we go on to Article 3, we have the role of the chair and the vice chair, but then we don't have any designations should the chair or vice chair not be available. So there's no sort of like, there's nothing to delineate that they would be able to, if neither one could show up for a meeting, let's say, that they would be able to appoint in their position. And I don't know if that needs to be there or not, but again, I just want to.
Yeah, I think that's a given, because if we go back and look at the duties of the chair, he can conduct and he can delineate somewhere. I saw this assigned duties, and therefore the chair can do that, someone other than the vice chair. That's my assumption on that. If I'm wrong about that, Heidi?
I mean, typically you can, but if we want to be very specific about that in the bylaws, we can put a designation.
Yeah.
Okay.
The designation would be that the chair, in the absence of the vice chair, may select another member to act in the position for chair and vice chair at that point in time. Is that what you want, please, Dr. Lynch?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, yeah. Just making it clear.
Would that cover the situation that suppose Ike and Britt went on a road trip and for some reason we could not get a hold of them and they were unavailable?
Unavailable to make decisions. You mean not just have meetings, but make decisions?
Right. Or they were just missing and we were supposed to have a meeting, and if something happens to Ike and Britt, do we have the legal whatever is needed to continue operating?
So under the bylaws, we haven't specifically dealt with that. I think in that unlikely situation, unfortunate situation, I think that, at that point, we may need to get a new chair if they're just completely unavailable and we have no idea where they are. I would hope that if we could just move back down to, I don't know if we should put it in 2.3 or 2.2, but that typically a delegation would be made by the chair. But I mean, we could put something in if they're both unavailable. I mean, I think you'd really have to define what unavailable means at that point. Like, how long do they have to be unavailable? Do we, I haven't seen that dealt with in bylaws before. I think because that event seems unlikely, but if it were to happen, I guess we could try to think about what the proper approach would be.
I think the approach would be, if at all, to do it is very rare. In the absence of the chair and vice chair and no delegation, the majority of the board can proceed to conduct regularly scheduled meetings and not get into all the circumstances, conditions.
And who would be chairing that meeting? A meeting like that?
Meaning that the majority would determine that. They would have to determine that themselves. So you're simply saying that the majority, in the absence of those and no delegation, the majority of the board can conduct regular scheduled meetings.
And maybe select an acting chair or something like that to conduct.
When you say regular scheduled meetings, it means that they can do all of those things.
Okay.
And that way you get it that way, so that you know that if that happens, no vice chair, no delegation, that a majority of the board can conduct regular scheduled meetings.
So can I read a motion just so we can kind of clarify? The motion is to amend the draft bylaws, and we will locate the right place to put this, that to read or to provide that if the chair and vice chair are unavailable, a majority of the board.
No. And there's no delegation.
And there's no delegation. I'm sorry. And no delegation has occurred. A majority of the board can act.
Right.
To include conducting meetings.
Right.
Does,
Aye to that motion. How do I do that?
but
So
the,
moved.
So moved.
There was a question from Brett. You had a question, Brett?
yeah, I do. I mean, when you say, I think we all understand what it's meant, but this will be written down on a page and people won't have been in this conversation. What does delegation mean in this context?
You need to delegate someone as to act as the chair.
Okay, so I think that needs to be in there.
We include that. And there's no delegation for a chair. No delegation of an acting.
Yeah, and let me just ask, Heidi, are we in any trouble calling this an acting chair, since the chair is legally appointed by the governor? And could it be convener, or I don't know. I may be raising something that is irrelevant, but the chair has such special is so specially designated. I'm wondering, can you call somebody a chair if they haven't, even as an acting, if they haven't been blessed by the governor?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I didn't say a chair.
No, you didn't. That's why
the majority of the board could
conduct business. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think we run into that problem.
So then we don't need delegation.
Well,
no delegation of duties.
Yeah. Okay.
Not maybe necessarily conferring that title, but a delegation of the ability to conduct duties. Okay. I think we might need a second for that motion.
Second.
And if there's no question or discussions, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay.
Opposition? Hearing none, the motion carries.
Okay, so we can move back down to section 2.3. We had the motion to remove August. So we're moving down to meetings, Article 3, Section 3.1. Okay, so regular meetings, the board will meet regularly as determined by the chair. We will, I'm just going to make a motion. Well, I'll read a motion in a moment just to remove all references to August as your annual meeting. I think here we would want to amend to just say that there will be an annual meeting at least once each year. The
Why don't we,
location-
rather than do that for each section, why don't we make that August elimination throughout the entire document so that we won't have to come back and motion up each and every time?
Right. Okay. So the motion is to remove references to August as the annual meeting date, annual meeting month throughout the document.
A
Second.
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 So I think the chair made the motion, and
I
I don't
second.
know, Rachel, you might have gotten the second.
Been moved in second. Any discussion on the removal of August as opposed to regular meeting date? All right, I hear no discussion. All in favor of the motion indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposition? Hearing none, aye, the motion is carried.
Great, thank you. For location, by statute, your meetings are required to be both live streamed and archived via video conference. So this is just letting you know that the video conference application is allowed so long as members of the public are permitted to view the proceedings contemporaneously, subject to any exception provided in the Open Meetings Act, for instance, if you needed to have an executive session. Scrolling down to D, this is your public notice requirement. The public notice of meetings will be provided 7 calendar days before the meeting unless circumstances warrant otherwise as determined by the chair. Your meeting schedule, I believe, I believe is going to be posted or has been posted. And I think that Rachel posts also the meeting notices in the General Assembly, on the General Assembly website.
But that's
Okay.
in terms of the state law, in terms of the length, the time frame for notices, are we consistent with that, or is it different by any chance?
There's not a requirement. It just needs to be a reasonable amount of notice. Most boards strive for 7 days, but that doesn't always, that doesn't always happen. There are things that happen, emergencies arise, last minute items are constantly being added to agendas. And so just because they come up, so the subject matter comes up and needs to be dealt with. So 7 days is sort of what most boards use, but there will be times when that's not possible. Posting the meeting notice and agenda on your board website constitutes public notice. So even if Rachel isn't able to get it into the General Assembly website, on your board website will be sufficient to comply with the Open Meetings Act. The notice will clearly state whether the meeting will be taking place in person. So, your meetings, again, all have to be live streamed, but like you did for the joint meeting that you did with the State Board of Education, that was in person and live streamed. And then we reiterated that rule that they all have to be live streamed and archived. Moving down to E, the chair can cancel a regular meeting of the board, and reasonable notice of cancellation must be given prior to the meeting. Reasonable notice is always going to be based on circumstance. Reasonable notice might be, if there's a huge emergency or some weather event or act of God, something like that. Reasonable notice might be 5 minutes or 2 days or 2 weeks. It just depends on what the situation is for needing to cancel the meeting. Moving down to F, in addition to your regularly scheduled meetings, the chair may also call additional non-scheduled meetings. And the notice of the additional meetings are going to be provided on the board website and also to an email distribution whenever that's possible. So I know that Rachel has a distribution list of stakeholders and various other folks that would be interested in knowing about an additional meeting, and she would send that out via email. Were there any questions in the meeting section? Okay, hearing none, we'll move down to your rules of order, section 3.2. Okay, in A, we talk about your quorum. As you know, a quorum must be present to conduct the official business of your board. A quorum of your board shall consist of the majority of members currently serving on the board. A member who is not physically able to attend or is not physically in attendance may attend.
Please, let me ask a question, please.
Yes.
Consistent majority of members currently serving.
Mhm.
We may have already had a person to leave, so how would that fit within currently serving?
So you currently have, there are 7 spots on your board, but you only currently have 6 people filling those spots. So it's a quorum of 6. Now, in this case, the quorum for 6 or 7 is the same. It's 4. If you only had 5 members currently serving, your quorum would move down to 3.
Okay.
So
right.
it doesn't affect your business to be able to, you're not going to be stymied by a vacancy.
Gotcha. Okay.
There shall be no effect on the quorum if a member of the board has to abstain or declines to vote. So they're still there for the purpose of a quorum, or if they're disqualified. And that's discussed further down. Disqualification is discussed further down in section 4.1. Were there any other questions on quorum? Okay, so we can move down to B, public testimony. And I believe there might have been some thoughts or questions on this. Currently, the draft bylaws provide that the chair will allow up to 15 minutes total for public testimony at the beginning of each regularly scheduled meeting. Public testimony would be based on the order in which requests are received. Requests shall be provided to the board in advance. And the public may submit, is not required to, but may submit written testimony to the board staff at any time, and it will be shared with the board. And we also, in this section, talked about each person's testimony would be subject to a 3-minute time limit. Were there any questions on this section?
Yes. I like the 15 minutes. I think that's pretty generous, but depending upon the subject matter, the timing, and the amount of public interest, at some point, 15 minutes may not be adequate. And I don't want to be tied into a situation where we have something of grave interest and we only allow by law 15 minutes. I think that we need to have a little flexibility here.
Can I ask a clarifying question about that? I mean, could it be that as part of our bylaws, we have 15 minutes as a standing agenda item? And then to the chair's point, if there was something that was coming up, we could add a separate agenda item extending that time and extending public comment. So it's at least 15 minutes, but in those cases where we feel like we need more time, we could add an extra agenda item with more public testimony time.
I appreciate it, and I think that's the one approach, but I just want us not to be in a position that we turn the public off because we have not been flexible and we stick to some hard and fast rule that is not warranted in a situation that we need to be a little bit more flexible.
I think my concern, Chair, is that there's also I think that we could also find that public testimony could go on for quite some time. It could actually impede the board's ability to get to the business if you had to spend, say, an hour listening to testimony on a regular basis, then that may impede the board's ability to do the work. So I think there's a balance somewhere.
Yeah, I understand, but if you have to balance it, I think you should leave in the discretion of the chair or executive director to make it on that. And if you have to err, my view is err on the side of abundance of providing greater flexibility rather than to restrict it. I just don't want us to be in a situation say, well, 15 minutes is up. We've got a large amount of testimony on a very important subject that is very timely. That would be a public relations disaster for us.
So could you add another sentence here after scheduled meeting and say something like this may be too much flexibility, but say something like at the chair's discretion. he or she may extend the 15-minute
Yeah.
period.
I think that would be fine. And don't try to put a time on it, and you know,
Yeah,
you
just may extend
judgment.
15-minute period.
Dr. Stapleton, I see your hand is up. Is it on the same issue?
It's just a practical matter. If we have this for our meeting, how would our meeting today have changed? Should we have allowed an extemporaneous public comment period?
So
Just most boards that I've served on, there is a period of time at the beginning of the meetings for public testimony or for public comments.
Yeah.
The time may vary from that. The Board of Regents, if you wanted to go before the University of Maryland Board of Regents, there's an open session at the very beginning of the meeting. You just have to give notice and they make a discretion of how long it would be. That's pretty common.
Okay, so in this case today, nobody had contacted
No.
us ahead of time asking for the opportunity.
So-
Well, we didn't have
So-
this as part of our bylaws. so-
right, you haven't adopted it in the bylaws yet. So so from the staff perspective, if this is what you choose to do, then we would set up a process whereby people would, there would be a way on the website for people to request to testify. And we were thinking also at the beginning of each meeting, that's pretty standard. And we would, if it's the 3 minutes, then, there would be basically 5 slots available each meeting. And then I guess with this discussion about the discretion to extend it, I guess we would, maybe we would allow for additional folks to sign up, and then it would be at the discretion of the
Leave
chair.
that, it's like the board, just leave that at the discretion of the chair, executive director, whether they want to extend that and have to put some trust and confidence in people's ability to do this. This is something that's pretty common. They have been extended. They have worked fairly well. If you err, believe me, err on the side of giving this kind of deference to the public.
So to clarify, we want to leave in the 15 minutes, but also have an extension of the discretion of the chair.
Yes.
Okay, so on this, for this motion, the motion is to amend section 2.3B, public testimony, B1, to read the chair shall allow up to 15 minutes, comma, or longer, at the discretion of the chair.
15 minutes.
No. Make another sentence.
Yeah.
Just say at the chair's discretion, comma,
Okay.
he or she may extend the 15-minute period.
And Heidi, before we have a full motion on B1, just so that we don't have to have 2 different motions, the request to have shall be provided or shall be allowed in the order in which the requests are received. I'd like us to consider that, because I think that there are people who sort of have the ability to log on every time that these become available. Or what I want to be mindful of is a system by which we hear from the same people week after week, and those who aren't able to cite, be the first come, first serve would have the opportunity to speak. So I don't know if there's a way to maybe consider by random selection or giving priority to people who have not spoken before, so that we can hear from a breadth, but just so that we aren't giving advantage to somebody who has the ability to be in that priority list.
And we could just strike that second sentence if you'd like, and you all can come up with a policy on that. However you'd like to deal with that. I don't know if you want to deal with that here or you want to come up with some sort of policy later.
I'm not sure you're going to be able to write that precisely as you just described without running into a problem. And here's how it has worked. And what she just stated is a very, very valid point. But here's how it has worked in places that I've been around. People sign up, they indicate the subject matter and the organization they're speaking from. If you have people from the same organization or people talk about the same subject matter, whatever, discretion of the director and the chair is that they adjust that list. Say, we got 5 people from the union just talking about X. We're not going to hear 5 people talk about X. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to manage it in terms of what was random, who was first, who was not first. It is something that is managed by the chair, executive director, to make a decision about how many and whether or not it's a duplication or what have you. So you have to leave that at some level of discretion. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to legislate that precisely the way you want to, because it's going to be all over the lot. You have 15 minutes. We try to accommodate and try to be as fair as we can, and that's it.
I would suggest to that point, just taking it out and then creating a policy, because I do fear that if it's at your discretion, that there will then at some point in time be the charge of you're not allowing us to speak or something like that. So I do think that there needs to be a clear policy, but if we could take that out here, so that's just not part of our bylaws, I think that works.
I would suggest you put it in the bylaws. But what I'm saying to you is that that yes, there may be people who raise the question of whether or not someone has been unfair. I recognize that. But if you try to prescribe it and put it in writing, you're going to still have the same problem. And I've had that happen. People, well, you're unfair. Didn't give us enough time. You called on this person, not on the person. You're not going to avoid that. That's part of the public process. We just had a matter before the Board of Regents with a number of unions that showed up. Their biggest complaint, they didn't have enough people there, and they questioned the chair, they questioned the chancellor, everybody else. That happens. And so we should not be fearful that we won't get a criticism of it. But at least you've given people an opportunity and you try to be fair. But if you want to write something in, I would just simply say that if you leave it up to the chair, leave it up to the executive director, and work it from there, is going to be your best shot. Otherwise, you're going to err on the wrong side, in my opinion.
May I recommend?
Oh, I was going to say, Heidi, so I think just to sort of summarize, my input would be to remove this language and then to have us separately create a policy that we put on the website and that has a clear thing, but that we indicate it. And then my part 2 is to consider changing up the 3-minute time limit to a 2-minute time limit so that we can hear from more people each week. And 2 minutes is still a sizable amount of time to share thoughts. And that is it on my B1 and 2 input.
Could we take each of these as a separate motion just so we can ensure that we have the correct language? So I believe that Vice Chair Kerwin articulated a new second sentence regarding the chair being able to exercise discretion to extend the time for the overall time limit for public testimony. Mr. Chair, would you like to take a motion on that at this time?
Yes.
Mr. Vice Chair, was that a motion? Did you make that motion? Okay.
I moved it.
A second. All right, let's go back to discussion. I think, I think there was a question raised a moment ago that went to this. So let's try to consider the question that has a different approach on this.
I thought we were ready to take a vote on this first motion that Britt made.
All right. All in favor of the motion as articulated, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposition? Hearing none, the motion carries.
Okay, thank you so much. The second motion would be to strike the current second sentence, beginning with public testimony, the current, that's in the current draft.
So
Is there a
moved?
Thank you.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. We strike the entire section from public testimony all the way down to with the board.
No, just the second sentence.
Yes,
Public
yes.
testimony shall be allowed and then are received at the end. Okay.
Is that correct? Okay. The motion is that we strike from public testimony all the way down to receive the second sentence. In discussion about that particular removal of amendment. Okay. Hearing none, the motion is for us to remove the second sentence only. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposition? Hearing none, the motion carries.
Okay, and there's one last motion in this section, B2. The motion is to amend, each person's public testimony shall be subject to, and we would amend 3-minute time limit to be 2-minute time limit. Is there a motion?
I will move it since I suggested it.
I second it. And I have a question about it as well. So moved and properly second that it be reduced to 2 minutes time limit. I would also say this should be subject to the discretion of the chair and to the executive director. We know what it is, but you should also make for exceptions in case there are problems associated with this as well. So the standard would be 2 minutes, but the chair or executive director should be allowed to make adjustments depending on circumstances and conditions. Otherwise, you run into the same problem I described above, that you're limited to some people who may have important testimony to give, and it's a very complicated issue, and you may want to give 3 minutes or whatever it may be. And you have an overall time limit, you're trying to get 15 minutes. I think it's best to provide a little bit of flexibility as well. And so I would add that as an adjustment to the minute. It's just 2 minutes, but subject to the discretion of the chair or the executive director in terms of whether or not you want to extend that.
As a practical matter, I don't see how the executive director makes the exception. I mean, you'd be chairing the meeting.
Yeah.
And so you would be, I think it would be awkward for Rachel to step in and say,
the chairman.
yeah.
Need to have some.
I wonder, could we just use the same language that we added? We added that sentence above at
Yeah.
the discretion of the
Yes.
chair.
Yeah.
And would Dr. Lynch like to amend her motion?
Okay, so I guess can I amend my motion to say subject to a 2-minute time limit? Time limits may be adjusted at the discretion of the
chair.
the chair. And I think that I would like to add and will be something to the fact and will, like, the decision will be made before the meeting. So it's not just like you come in and you have a lot to say and I'm letting you have 3 minutes and I'm letting you have 2 minutes, but it's like, if we say, like the comprehensive implementation plan is a good example, people have a lot they want to say, that if we're adjusting that time limit, that time limit is a clear adjustment before the meeting begins. Does that make sense?
Well, all of it is going to be before the meeting. So people
correct, yeah. So it's a uniform adjustment, basically, yeah. I think is so.
Can I ask a clarifying question here? This section in the bylaws just refers to the standard agenda item to allow for at least 15 minutes of public testimony time at the beginning of each meeting. But there still are for sure going to be times when we're going to have separate public hearings on specific topics like updates to the comprehensive plan, proposed outcome measures, all that kind of stuff. And those would not be bound to follow these rules.
Yeah. And that's why it's generally somewhat flexible, because you're not dealing with a normal public hearing. You're trying to accommodate people because you're meeting, and there may be interests or subject matter or challenges or issues that may pop up. And so you need flexibility as much as you can to manage this. And this is what normally happens. You try to do it best you can in advance, but there may be circumstances and conditions that you probably cannot do that because something happens between the time a person signed up and they actually have the meeting. And you're right, I forgot to mention that this is not your normal public hearing. This is to accommodate public comment because you are in fact having a meeting and an opportunity for the public to be heard.
Is it too generic to just have it read each person's public testimony shall be subject to a time limit?
Well, yeah, you could do that, but again, this is flexible.
Yeah, I think setting the expectation that if you're coming, you gotta do it in 2 minutes is a good thing.
Yeah.
So that we don't have
Leave room for
clarity, and people have clarity in what they're going to be able to do.
Yeah.
And if somebody's making a particularly relevant point and has a few more minutes to say, the chair should be, would have the flexibility to let them finish.
I think what I'm hearing in general is that there is a desire to be both prescriptive, which is the point of bylaws, and allow for flexibility. And so I do wonder if we aren't sort of better in reshape, because I think with every section, we're going to have this same conversation around flexibility. And so I'm wondering if we can't do both, if we can't be prescriptive and then maybe add another section that says, the items listed above are subject to change based on, the discretion of the chair and approval of the board or something like that.
Ooh, I think that would be too generic, too general, for too many provisions in the bylaws if it isn't tailored to wherever we want the chair to have discretion.
My guys, we're not reinventing the wheel. This happens all the time, every day with the body. Just simply give the prescriptive 2 minutes, discretion of the chair, the time and other circumstances may be adjusted, and leave it at that. Otherwise, we'd be spinning around something for which most bodies deal with this fairly regularly. And you don't have to put who signed up first, who did this, and change it in advance. 2 minutes at the discretion of the chair, that may or may not be may be adjusted. That's all you need to do. You're not going to work this out precisely the way you want in every circumstance and condition. And it's not something which bodies have not had the ability to deal with.
And just as a general sort of drafting convention, I would just say that placing sort of overall discretion at a different part of the bylaws than where that discretion's being, is allowed can get a little confusing. I mean, if somebody doesn't read all the way down, they're going to think that it's prescribed and they haven't read all the way down to the part where discretion is allowed. So we tend to like to kind of put that discretion exactly with the prescription when possible.
Yeah. We made this more complicated than it is. You said 2 minutes with prescription, and you allowed for some discretion to go beyond that at the discretion of the chair. That's all we need to say at this point in time for this section. And I hope that we just leave it at that and we can move on.
Can I just clarify the last point of Dr. Lynch's motion? She also asked that those decisions be made ahead of time. So there were 3 pieces.
That is nice on paper, but it doesn't work because there's too many things happen in between that. You try to do that ahead of time. That's what you want to do. And you try to get all the people to sign up, but you have to leave some level of discretion. And otherwise you end up being too bureaucratic and you end up with too many complaints. That's a given. You're going to say, sign up, we'll take you. You got 2 minutes, and that's the way we want to operate it. But as Bridget just stated, you may have a problem that develops in between that time and something else that's transpired. And you need to just have that flexibility. That's all.
So we would need an amended motion from Dr. Lynch to remove that part of her motion.
Sure.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, did you want to call for a second?
Yep, there second. Okay, the motion now reads that we allow for 2 minutes for a time limit, subject to discretion of the chair, and that will be the motion that we have with this section B2, I guess. And we're not applying this to any other place. If we have discretion, we're going to look at it precisely the location we're talking about. So that's the motion. 2 minutes. Changes the discretion of the chair.
So moved.
Okay. Any further discussion? All in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 In opposition, hearing none. 2 minutes, subject to discretion of the chair. All right, let's go on, Heidi.
Very good. If we can scroll down, Graham, to page 5. top of page 5. I think the last thing was just that I'm sorry, could you scroll up one more second? I think we might have missed one last thing. Okay, so we're just going to follow the Open Meetings Act. I don't think anybody has any issue with that because that's something that we're required to do. So moving down to the meeting agenda, section 3.3. At a minimum, the meeting agenda shall include the date, time, and location of the meeting. Your meetings are virtual, so we'll just have a virtual information in there. The topics to be discussed and which portions, if any, of the meeting will be conducted in closed session. Just by point of clarification, closed sessions may also be called during meetings, and so they may not be an agenda item, but if something comes up that we need to discuss in closed session, for instance, legal advice, that you may request as the meeting happens, it doesn't have to be on an agenda. We can move into closed session as needed. But when we know there's going to be a closed session, it will be on the agenda. Additional items may be added to the agenda at the discretion of the chair. And then during each meeting, the executive director will deliver a report to the board of the activities of the AIB since the last meeting, and those the report items are included there for your review. Were there any questions on A or B?
Okay, I have an easy one, Heidi.
Yes.
For item B, where the executive director shall deliver to the board, there may be a time when the executive director is not able to attend the meeting. So can we put something in there that says, during each meeting, the executive director or the executive director's designee shall deliver the board,
Excellent.
Yes,
Good.
and that's acceptable. Would you like to make that motion? Is that I'm sorry, was that a motion?
Yeah, that was a motion. I'll make that a motion.
Seconded.
And I'm proud to second it.
Okay, it's been moved in second. Is there any discussion on the motion? Okay, hearing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Hearing none, the motion carries.
Okay,
Dr.
then we,
Stapleton?
Yeah, I just had it occurred to me in B, 3.3B, where it says the activities of the AIB since the last meeting. Our agency has a very unfortunate name in that it Accountability Implementation Board. Sometimes that implies the 7-member governing board of the AIB, and sometimes it refers to all of the staff activities. I just wonder if we should clarify that either in the glossary above or here.
we could say AIB staff. I think AIB is, it's defined in statute as the board itself, and I don't want to get too. I'm a little bit concerned about confusing that definition. So if we wanted to say AIB staff, which would be everybody except for the board members. The AIB would be board members and staff. I mean, that's kind of encompassing the whole.
Then and I would imagine that Rachel probably would give a report about that because it would include, somebody went to go talk to some group. So I do want to make sure that this implies the activities of the staff and the entire entity, which includes the members, but I just don't know if that connotation is there.
Just to agree, yes, that was the intent, was that it would be all of the activities of the agency and the board.
I mean, if you interpret it strictly, Heidi, you defined AIB at the beginning of the document. And AIB, I think, was the board. Was it not?
Yep, it is the board. I think we talked later on in the second sentence about the significant activities of the AIB and its staff.
Yeah.
If you want to say here, we could say activities of the AIB and its staff since the last meeting.
Yeah. I think logically that's what we should do. It may be getting down into the weeds, but.
Can I put that forward as a motion then?
And I'll second it.
Any discussion on the motion? All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Thank you. No opposition? The ayes have it.
Dr. Lynch, did you have something in this section?
I was just wondering if it was possible to also include, it talks about the meeting agenda shall include the date, time, and location, but I'm also wondering about the supporting documents, like, and as appropriate, links to supporting documents, so that, you know, if there's a presentation that's coming from MSDE, that is also sort of linked to the agenda, or is that in a separate location?
So the way we do it, we don't link them in the agenda, but we post the agenda and then we also post the meeting materials in the same location on the website.
Okay.
So that you can click on all the materials are posted there in the same
Okay.
place.
That's fine then.
Okay.
Okay, so if there weren't any other questions on this section, we can move down to C, open meeting summary and closed session minutes. Okay, so just to clarify here, when under state law, when an open meeting is available via live and archive video, you don't have to do specific minutes like you would think of as, you know, kind of the play-by-play. You can do a written summary of the meeting. And so that's what the subcommittee has recommended here. So the open meetings will, as required by statute, be available by live and archive video. A brief written summary of each meeting shall be prepared by the executive director, which we talked about in as the summary in 3.3A2 above. Closed meeting minutes will include, and this is required under the Open Meetings Act, a summary of the meeting, the individuals in attendance, and the actions taken. It's a very high-level summary. The closed meeting minutes shall remain sealed unless the requirements of the Open Meetings Act are met, a certain provision of that Open Meetings Act, and only that summary of the closed meeting shall be provided publicly pursuant to the Open Meetings Act. Were there any questions so far on this section? Okay, I'll keep going. If the executive, yes.
Peggy, I'm sorry. And this is not necessarily in this section, but I realized that there's a piece, there's the agenda and the announcement of the agenda, and then there's the meeting, and then now we're talking about kind of the summary of the meeting. What about those supporting materials that Jennifer just mentioned, and they're going to be linked? Should we have an expectation that supporting materials be available at like X number of days before the meeting so that we all have sufficient time to review?
Available to the members?
Right.
I'm not sure that I can't remember. I don't think we talked about this specifically in the bylaws. That would be, I think, something you can talk about it in the bylaws if you want, or you could just provide direction to the executive director. That's sort of between you and your staff. It's up to you how you'd like to handle that.
I'm throwing this out now to my colleagues. What do you think?
I think it has to be either a bylaw or a policy so that we can do we have to have ample time to review in order to be able to do the work. And that's not only for materials coming from the executive director's team, but also from outside sources. So when people are doing, you know, like when MSD is providing us with a PowerPoint or whatever, that we have ample time to preview that and construct questions so that we can do the work of the board. I don't know if it's a bylaw or a policy, but I agree that it has to be spelled out somewhere.
Mm-hmm. I think it should be more of a policy than a bylaw.
Yeah.
I agree.
I agree.
Yeah, and your policies will be a little bit, you'll be able to revisit those, I think, in ways that are a little less formal than sort of this process, but and you may need to do that as we sort of develop as a board. Okay, were there any additional questions there?
Second, is there a motion that this be part of a policy? If so, I'd like to hear it.
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Is there a motion? Because I had two different questions here. We need to consider as a policy, a bylaw. The question I was asking, one prepared to make a motion that it be a policy. I thought that was that's what the last.
If it's a policy, I don't think you need a motion. You just have all agreed that you want to develop a policy to address this. But if there's still a desire to put it in the bylaws, then you would need a motion for that.
I guess that's what I'm trying to clarify now,
Right.
whether or not we'll put it in the bylaws or a policy.
No, I do not want to make a motion to put it in the bylaws.
Okay. Then it'll be part of a policy. We don't need a motion.
Okay.
On 3.3C1, do we also want to include Dr. Doss's language here that the written summary shall be prepared by the executive director or his or her designee?
Ooh, I like that.
Sure. And just to clarify, I mean, Rachel will always be able to delegate or designate other people to do what she needs them to do, but we can certainly make that very clear in the bylaws. So was that a motion, Mr. Manko?
Yeah, I'd like to put it forward as a motion.
Okay. There's a motion to add designee to the executive director in terms of preparing the summary.
Second.
Okay, moved in second. Any discussion on? Here, no further discussion. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
In opposition? Hearing none, motion carries.
Okay, very well. Moving down to C3, if Rachel, the executive director, is not able to attend a closed session, then I, or your assistant attorney general, or one of the members would be responsible for preparing a closed meeting summary and minutes. In the unlikely event that either Rachel nor I are there, then if you all go into closed session, you would need to designate someone to take those minutes and create a summary. The draft written summary is to be prepared and presented to all board members promptly after the meeting. Again, promptly is going to be subject to interpretation depending on circumstances. The authority to approve the written summary in a draft form is delegated to the chair. The executive director shall post the draft written summary on the board website. Any questions on that section? Okay, I don't see any. Number 5, at the next scheduled meeting, the board will review and approve the written summary of the last meeting. This is your typical parliamentary procedure. The executive director shall replace the draft written summary with the approved written summary on the board's website. Okay, we can scroll down to the next page. These are your rules of conduct, Article 4, Article 4.1 ethics. This is provided directly from the ethics law. And this is actually pretty timely because you have some ethics filings that are going to become due by April 30th. Your financial disclosure statement is required. And we've also reiterated here, and again, this was pulled directly from the MLDS bylaws, that you will adhere to the prohibition against solicitation or acceptance of gifts or honoraria. So that was just a reiteration of that section of the law. And then disqualifications due to conflict of interest. If we could scroll down a little bit, Graham. Perfect, thank you. And this is the section having to do with conflicts of interest and when you'll recuse yourself. You may not participate as to a matter if you have a relative with an interest in the matter and the member knows of the interest, is part of a business entity which has an interest in the matter, is negotiating employment or has arranged prospective employment with a business entity that has an interest in the matter, has a direct financial interest in the matter, has provided support through a contribution to or volunteering for or a candidate or petition that is the subject of the matter, or if we could scroll down a little bit here, Graham. Thank you. Otherwise believes the participation would create a conflict of interest. So those are your conflict of interest rules, and you would need to recuse yourself. You can always seek an opinion from the State Ethics Commission if you have questions, and you can consult either Rachel or I on how to do that. That was the next section. And if if we could scroll down just a little bit more, Graham, number 3, if a member has recused him or herself or is disqualified participating in a matter before the board, the recusal or disqualification shall be recorded in the meeting minutes. Are there any questions on this section? This is again pulled directly from state law. Okay, great. Section 4.2, and this may be the section where we want to talk about, I think we were talking a little bit about vacancies or removals. So a member who chooses to resign shall provide written notice of resignation to the governor, the president of the Senate, the speaker of the House of Delegates, the chair, and the executive director. Those 3 elected officials at the beginning are listed because they are, I think they were chosen because they are the members who appoint the nominating board. And so if somebody was going to resign, they would want to know about that. Does anybody have a question on this section? I think if we're talking about staff again, I believe that we were going to either do a policy or talk about termination of staff in its own section for personnel. This has to do more with members, and again, members are not subject to any, removal rules that are created by this board or by this commission. Okay.
Let me ask you a question here, because just assume that a person would go through a formal resignation process. But you could have a de facto resignation. Person just decides to show up, just said, I don't want to participate anymore, and leave. Mm-hmm. Doesn't do anything. Based on this, the person's still in good standing.
They are. I think a resignation has to typically there would have to be some sort of overt act for that resignation to occur. I mean, I think if somebody provided their resignation notice to, for instance, the chair, I think that you could probably waive the rest of these and just say that they did provide that notice. But if they don't tell anybody and they just don't show up, I think they would still be a member of the commission. And based on the next section, there would probably be grounds for removal. Again, that removal will be subject to state law.
Hey, I resign, I'm out of here, I do not want to participate anymore, and just don't show up. Based on this, unless they've sent a letter or notice, that's not a resignation. And to me, I think that is. They've indicated that they resigned. They just didn't send the letter.
Right. And I think probably Rachel and I have seen this with boards, a lot of boards in the past. This was, I believe this was part of the MLDS bylaws. And this was subject to some discussion by the subcommittee. I think this is up to you all how you want to handle this. My recommendation might be that you just don't have this section. I mean, if someone says to the chair, I resign, I'm done, then I think that you could accept that as a resignation. And the preference would certainly be that you have some sort of written evidence of that resignation. That would be the preference. So I think that's up to you all how you want to handle that.
Okay.
I think there has to be some written intention to resign. Otherwise, it would become he said, she said. And so.
No, let me back up. The person says clearly that I resign. I don't believe in this mission. I'm no longer participating. And you don't see them for a year. That's what they said. I've seen that happen.
Yeah.
So the question is, if you have this section, officially they have not resigned. So the question would be, and I thought the council indicated earlier, if they've indicated in some visible form or fashion otherwise, I think that you could treat that as though they've informed the necessary officials. And so what happened They just simply wrote a letter saying, based on your conduct and based on the information you provided to X, you have resigned. If you have any other question, this is where we want to treat it. They never responded. And so they treated it as a resignation. So that letter, without the response, based on what I've just described, was treated as a resignation. But it was not as here. If you don't write the letter to the speaker, to the president, and to the governor, you have not.
Yeah, all I'm saying is there's got to be something in writing,
Mhm.
because the person who, in your example, who maybe the next year says, you know what, I'm more interested now. I'm going to come back.
No, there was something in writing.
Yeah, that's
They
what
wrote-
I'm saying. If as long as there's something in writing,
No, they wrote the person a letter. They're
right?
not here. They wrote him a letter saying, based on your action and conduct,
Right.
we will treat your information as a resignation. They
Yeah,
never.
that's
So that
what I'm
letter,
saying. There was something in writing. That was a letter from
Yeah.
the board to the person.
right.
I think I would be a little bit concerned that if you write that letter and the person doesn't respond, and you consider that, I don't know, number one, I don't know if that's going to be accepted by, for instance, the appointments office. I mean, not the appointments office, by the nominating board as
The resignation.
a resignation. And number two, if that person were to come back and say, I never said that, and then now that constitutes a removal, and you all don't have the ability to remove a member.
Right.
So I would really, there really needs to be something in writing from a member. And if they don't, in section 4.3, we talk about level of effort. So we talk about the things that they have to do. And I would say if somebody doesn't show up for, 6 out of 12 meetings, then without a good excuse, without, something that the chair accepts as a good excuse, then that would be grounds for removal. But I would just be concerned. I understand what you're saying, Mr. Chair. I would just be worried in the circumstance that a member, again, an unlikely event, but a possible event that person would come back and say, I never said that. I never said that I wanted to resign.
I mean, to me, it seems like this is typical for any position. Someone goes to their boss. In this case, they would go to Ike and Rachel and say, I want to resign. And Ike and Rachel would respond by saying, if you want to, you need to put it in writing, make sure it's signed. And they just maybe send an email saying, I officially resign my position. And that would be passed along to these individuals, the governor, the president of the Senate, the speaker of the House, and whoever else needed to know about it. So maybe some of this is just clarifying a member who chooses to resign must provide written notice of resignation, and that written notice will be shared with these various entities.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
I think that's good.
Dr. Lynch, I see your hand up. Is it on this point or something else?
Yeah, I think I think Heidi sort of made the point of, I think it's actually two different things. One is a process of resignation, and then the other is if somebody doesn't show up, then that is sort of a termination, so that is a termination of duties. And so going back to, even though we don't have the ability to do it, in some way designating that there's a process by which somebody who's not fulfilling their duties will be referred to the governor's office for consideration for termination or something like that, so that it's not, we're not making determinations and calling somebody else, did you resign or not resign? But if somebody just stops showing up, we could say for failure to participate, we are referring this to the governor's office for consideration of removal or something.
Well, I'm not sure we need to have that in legislation, because I think that would follow, and I think that's probably the way you would deal with that in terms of termination, as you just described. That we can recommend to the governor or to the nominating committee that a person basically has decided that they do not want to participate, and we should seek their removal and pass it on to the governor or the nominating board.
So Heidi, is that something that could go in the bylaws, that the board may recommend the removal of a board member to the governor?
I mean, that is, you can put something into the bylaws for that recommendation. It's just that the actual process itself is prescribed
Right.
by law.
All we would be doing is recommending, as she just described,
Mhm.
to the approach. Yeah.
Aren't we on 4.2?
We are on 4.2 about resignations, but
Yeah,
we
so
could
I
either
think
add a
Joe
new
should
section.
make his motion.
I'm going to make a motion then on a modification to section 4.2 on the resignation, for it to read, a member who chooses to resign shall provide written notice of the resignation. This written
Period.
notice will be
Yeah.
shared with the governor, the president of the Senate, the speaker of the House of Delegates, the chair, and the executive director.
Yep.
Second.
Thanks, Jen.
Only question about your motion is that it makes it, the notice goes to the chair or to the executive director.
I don't think the motion specifies. It says they need to provide written notice of the resignation, and that notice needs to be shared with all of the individuals.
I
Why
would
don't
recommend
you-
it goes to someone.
Yeah.
So it's not, the written notice of resignation isn't, posted
But
in the
you go to
Baltimore
the
Sun.
chair.
why don't you just simply say that they need to provide written notice of their resignation? Leave it at that.
I think that is what Joe suggested, Mr. Manco, excuse me. But I think Heidi is suggesting we might want to specify at least one, the chair, that you have to notify the chair.
But would they even need to, like, if, as long as the written letter gets to the chair, like, if I decided I wanted to resign and I wrote it out and I gave it to Jen, and she passed it along to all, to the chair and to you, Rachel, and then it found its way into the hands of these other individuals. I think the main thing is we just need the documentation that someone is intending and deciding to resign.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to actually sort of push on that a little bit. I think it should be to the chair at least, because who's to say that, I don't know, I don't have beef with you, Joe, and I make up my own letter and give it to Rachel and I'm like, Joe resigned, did you know? I feel like there has to be, part of bylaws is having some specificity and some parameter. And so while we want to always we're trying to be as flexible as possible, which kind of flies in the face of the point of providing these clear parameters.
Understood.
Would never do that, by the way, Joe.
And it also just helps us because that triggers a vacancy, that's where the vacancy gets triggered, and it allows the nominating board to begin their work. So the less time there is between that notice getting from the chair to the nominating board.
I'd like to propose a friendly amendment to Joe's, that we say a written notice to the chair. Joe, do you accept that as a friendly amendment? Huh?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay. Good.
All right. The motion on the table now is that a member who chooses to resign should provide a written notice to the chair.
Right. And that notice will then be given to all these.
Shared.
Yeah. Good.
Okay. Any discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposition? Hearing none, the motion carries.
Very good. Any other questions there? We'll move on to section 4.3, level of effort. This is just a very general statement regarding the time and effort to ensure you fully understand your duties and obligations as members of the board. Were there any questions on 4.3?
Yeah. Does that go back to anything that the chair brought up about a wayward member, who doesn't come to the meetings and does not demonstrate the level of effort necessary? Does that go back to any of that?
Yes, I think this is where having this section in your bylaws would provide grounds, and maybe this is where you'd like to put the recommendation for removal. If someone is not expending the time and effort necessary to ensure their duties and obligations as members of the board, I think that's where you could sort of ground as your basis for a recommendation of removal.
I really struggled with this one because I have all these questions. How's this tracked and measured? Who determines who determines what is a substantial level of effort? What is too little level of effort? How do people get feedback on whether they aren't pulling their weight? And then, of course, what happens if this isn't met? That I think we've been talking about removal. But I think there's so much that needs to be teased out of this if we want to move forward with this section.
I agree, Joe. I mean, I feel like this is a level of effort of just like, hey, do you understand the responsibility? But then I feel like there's another section that sort of goes back to that removal, which is really about gross negligence of your duties in some way, which is different than just like dialing it in.
But there's nothing that indicates consequences of this. This is just a statement that you need to understand your roles and responsibilities, time and effort necessary. You didn't say that there's a judgment about this or that you can be removed if you did not exert the appropriate time and effort. So it's okay to tell people we expect you to put the time and effort without going back and identify precisely what it is, so long as we are not making that judgment and or we are not having any consequences to it.
Yeah, and I guess that I totally agree that it's very benign if that's the case, but you also wonder at some point if it's so benign that it doesn't even necessarily be in there, because if there's no teeth, then what happens if you don't put forth level of effort?
Yeah, but this is pretty standard in a lot of boards and other entities of this type, just saying we want you to be serious about the work, put the time. So that I don't think it hurts anything. And the way it is stated here, it has no legal consequence as a result. Are there any other questions? Heidi?
Okay, so we can move to Article 5. I'm sorry, did I hear another one?
Yes, please.
Okay, sorry. Section 5.1, the board. The board has the powers and duties assigned to it under Title 5, Subtitle 4 of the Education article. This is our whole article, our whole subtitle relating to AIB. Your subcommittee put together these specific, the specific 5 powers and duties that are listed below. Developing your comprehensive plan that's defined in 5-401E. Including a strategy for achieving the law's objectives, a timeline and milestones and outcomes to be achieved. B, holding the state and local government units accountable for implementing the comprehensive implementation plan and achieving established milestones and outcomes. C, approving state and local unit individual implementation plans. I can't get that word out. D, providing technical assistance, training, and other support to state and local government units in development and implementation of individual implementation plans. And E, educating the public and stakeholders about the purpose of the Blueprint for Maryland's Future and evidence-based practices.
This is from the statute, right?
This is probably paraphrasing the statute a little bit, but I mean, this kind of pulls in the main ideas. Right. I see that Dr. Lynch has a question.
Yeah, so I have 2 suggestions because I think this gets to the sort of statute end of the work, but I think what seems to be missing from this is some of the like the HR things, like being responsible for hiring the executive director and overseeing all human resources related activities to that hiring and to that staffing, and then overseeing the budget of the specific budget of the AIB.
Yeah, understand. Could there be an encompassing section here that speaks to the overall, all of those things which you've just described, because otherwise you could go to a whole litany of things that.
The administrative functions or the
Yeah.
administration functions or operational
Well,
functions.
yeah.
So maybe an F, and the operational and the administration and operation of the AIB and staff.
Yeah.
Or something along those lines.
Let me go back, because the executive director is the agent for which we should not be in detailed day-to-day operational stuff, but all of what she just described, all of that goes to the executive director. And I guess what we need to be able to say is that we need to make sure and to either evaluate, manage, and to ensure that the executive director is carrying out the normal functions that is expected of her, and that the board basically has that responsibility over her. You follow me? In other words, we should
and
detailed operation, but there is a responsibility that we need to make sure that the executive director is adhering to what it is that we think is appropriate in terms of managing all of that.
And I think there's two different components. One is the human resources component, and then one is sort of all of the other administrative functions. The way the law is written is it says the AIB will hire the executive director and staff. And it's going to sound like a technical thing, but I think if we're responsible for hiring the executive director and staff, then whatever our hiring process needs to include approval by the board. If the structure is we hire the executive director does all other things. Like, I think that nuance probably needs to be fleshed out in these bylaws so that we understand then how our policies would be developed.
Well, let me back up, because my assumption had been that in saying that we are overall responsible for hiring the staff means that we are delegating that to the executive director and that we're overseeing her. But if we are in the process of the board members, individual going out, interviewing and hiring the staff, that's a slippery slope that we should not be on. We should make sure we have the policies, the rules, regulation, and ensuring that the executive director is implementing all of those things. And that to me is basically hiring staff. We hired the staff through her. But if you're saying, no, we mean we are going to go out and we're going to actually interview people and overlook her shoulders on that. In that way, that's a very slippery slope. That's
well,
why
I think the law says hire the executive director and staff. So, and that's the point of me asking. And it doesn't mean that we're doing the day-to-day hiring, but that there is a process by which we issue final approval of all staff. Like, it may be something that in closed session that we just sort of issue approval of all final staff. If we want to interpret it differently to say we hire the executive director hires all of the staff, like, I do think that it sounds like a little thing, but it is a big thing, because one puts it sort of in our lap and one, sort of creates a more linear delineation.
Yes.
I think we may be skipping over.
How do we our staff if what we are doing when a person is hired, we are therefore given approval of that? That's still the same slippery slope. And I cannot believe that that is what we should be doing, or that was the intent. The intent is to manage the executive director and make sure that that person manages the staff, and we are hiring her. Indirectly, we are in fact hiring staff as well, but meaning that we have to approve people that have been hired, or that we have to interview people that have been hired, that is a very, very slippery slope. And I'm just telling you that would be a huge, huge challenge in any form or fashion on that. I want to make sure that we are holding Rachel accountable. We've got metrics for her in terms of her work and performance. We are properly evaluating her ongoing. We are evaluating the hires that she has in terms of how they acted or didn't act, and we hold her responsible for that. Those are the things that we should be doing. And I have no problem in, the annual review, annual reports. We do all of that. But if we get off into, we are reviewing the staff and how are we going to make that determination? And looking over the shoulders and say, well, okay, you've come to us, we presented to people that are hired. We've laid out a hiring formula. We've looked at the rules, regulations, responsibilities, and everything else that is associated with that. You can't make an appropriate judgment about that unless you're also interviewing the people, comparing the various candidates, and you'd have to interview virtually everybody. That's a slippery slope.
Well,
Because-
I guess, Heidi, my question to you is because, I'm not sort of weighing in on a preference of what the structure is, but I do think the structure has to be clear. And the law says we hire the executive director and staff. It doesn't say we hire the executive director hires staff. It doesn't mean that we can't interpret it differently, but I think that interpretation has to be clear, because I do think that at the end of the day, when we have staff, it'll be the AIB's staff, and there should be some sort of knowledge and approval, in my opinion, by the board of those staffing decisions, if they are in fact our responsibility as hires.
So this language is used throughout the code, and typically for really any other than your sort of quasi-legislative duties of adopting certain plans and policies and things like that, you can really delegate these administrative functions. But I will say the caveat to that is that no matter what you delegate, you as a board are always responsible. Right. For the actions of your executive director, your staff, your contractors, like anybody that is sort of in your realm that you have delegated responsibilities to. So you do have to exercise some oversight. What that oversight looks like is up to you as a board.
I mean, the delegation is pretty clearly articulated in the next section. And
it is. And I think if we get down to that, I understand what Dr. Lynch is saying, and I understand that concern. And so, you all can discuss that further if you'd like, but we can get down to that delegation section and maybe talk about some of those guardrails that you've put in place.
Okay, why don't we do that and we'll come back.
Mr. Manko has had his hand up.
Yeah, so I don't know if these things would just be included in the including but not limited to. So if that's the case, then I can definitely withdraw them. But I think there is a lot among these lists of responsibilities. It does seem like one of the important responsibilities that we have is making recommendations to the legislature about any potential changes. And I wonder if that should be delineated here in the bylaws. And then the second comment I had was, I don't particularly care for how unidirectional segment E is. Because I think it's about educating the public and stakeholders, but we've also taken a strong stance around soliciting input and getting feedback from the community. So, my preference would be that's a two-way interchange. But as I said before, this could all just be portions of included but not limited to, and they're just not spelled out in the same way that A, B, C, D, and E are.
I make? Yeah, I think Joe, particularly I like Joe's first point. I think that is so significant, and it's been raised in many of our hearings that probably ought to be mentioned in this list, even though it is buried in the titles. But I think including that as an F. And also, did we agree that we were going to add hiring the executive director as one of our duties?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking also that that's another little asterisk I have. I wonder, it's not just hiring the executive director, but it's also, you know, I don't know if there's a structure, you know, like the structure for annual reviews, providing feedback, you know, just the continue, it's not just a one-time situation, it's the continual support, evaluation and management of the ED.
Hiring and evaluating
Sure.
annually.
Yeah. So those are the three suggestions I would make in terms of a F and G, and then a modification to E.
And the clarification on the modification to E is just that we're going to receive information as well as, or receive education, or, okay.
Something akin to educating the public and stakeholders and soliciting their, you know, feedback and wisdom about the purpose of the Blueprint for Education and evidence-based practices.
Okay. Are there any questions about that addition? We'll take that as a sort of a friendly amendment. If there's anything else in there, so we can wrap them up together. Heidi, in that section. Was there something else in this section you wanted, Joe, as well, that you suggested?
No, just those three recommendations.
Okay. Could
Heidi,
you go back?
Can you summarize the three?
Go back to it again.
So the first would be modifying E so that it's representative of a kind of two-way flow of information, that we are educating the public and stakeholders, but we are also, you know, soliciting their feedback and, you know, getting their response around, you know, kind of effectiveness, how things are going. There is a point F, which is around providing recommendations annually to the legislature about proposed recommended changes to the legislation. And then there is a G.
Hey, Joe?
Yes.
Could we take out the word annually there? Because we may not want to recommend changes every year.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although I was thinking maybe annually we come to the decision that we're not making any change. We're not recommending any changes this year, but
Consider changes annually.
yeah, because I think, Rachel, we are required every year to go to the legislature and
With a report.
even
Yes.
if we're not recommending any changes at this point.
Correct. And the report would include any recommendations. And it is to the governor and the General Assembly. So I think you would want to add the governor to that.
Got it. And then a point G around our responsibility to hire and to evaluate the executive director.
Okay, we have all three changes. Is there a full motion to that, Joe? I guess what you've given is a motion that's second to Joe's motion.
Just so
Second.
you don't have to do another motion, Dr. Lynch, did you have other, I think you wanted to add something about overseeing the budget, or would that be one of the things to add to the list?
I think it was those administrative, I mean, I think it's just all of that, the sort of administrative things, being the AIB budget, you know, like sort of operational functions, but wasn't that included?
Can we take E and F that Joe just proposed and vote on those, and then
Yeah.
separate the operational stuff of the budget and the staff oversight?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
All right.
please.
Is there any question to the motion that's on board? I heard a second to it. Did I have a second to Joe's motion?
Second, sorry.
I will
second.
second E and F.
Any further discussion on the motion of those 3 points? All right, all in favor, please indicate.
Wait, I proposed just voting on the 2 points he made, the adjustment to E and the addition of F about the considering changes to the legislation.
Well, that's
I'd
just,
like to talk more about the organizational oversight.
Mr. Mango, do you amend your motion to that effect?
Yes, I amend my motion to conform with what Dr. Stapleton said.
okay. Just voting on 2 points. Any further discussion on those 2 points? Hearing none, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
I,
Okay, now we'll go back to the question on the 3rd point. All right. Dr. Lynch, you had a question about that?
so I think my original, the thing that sort of sparked the original question was to add the hiring of the executive director, but then overseeing some of the actual operating functions, like making sure that we have some sort of oversight on the actual AIB budget, not the budget of the LEAs, but that our in-house budget, our in-house processes.
Is that included, all of that included in oversight? Because if you start enumerating them, there may be things that you haven't forgotten or thought about that could be included in there. My assumption was that all of that is included in it. The administrative stuff, you're evaluating on that, you're looking at the budget, personnel decisions, all those kinds of things included in that oversight. Because if you start listing them, I'm not sure you're going to list them all. Something forgotten, you say, well, you know, I was not evaluated on this. This was not part of the list. So I'm not sure it's going to be that prescriptive.
I think my recommendation would be, you know, like oversee, you know, administrative functions and, you know, which may include but are not limited to human resources and the budget. Like, I do think that we have to in some way identify the budget. It's like, as the board, we should have some knowledge of what is happening with the budget that comes underneath our name. I think, not that we're directing it, but like we should be getting reports, like we should have some sort of knowledge of it. And if something's going awry, we should be able to do something about it.
All right, but why don't you state, you know, clearly so we understand, because I'm a little bit confused. So go back and indicate the motion that you would like to see in substitution of this, I guess.
Okay, so first of all, I'm lost as to where we are. Do we add hiring of the executive director? Because that's
where we're at now.
Okay, hiring of the executive director.
And
then, I'm sorry.
Hiring and evaluating the executive.
Hiring and evaluating the executive director. And then, you know, overseeing the operational and budgetary functions of the Office of the Accountability and Implementation Board Executive Director.
Okay.
Can I ask a question
Yes.
very
Sure.
quickly? I think oversight is definitely already implied in sort of your role as the board. So I think we would need to really understand what is meant by that, to really clarify for Rachel and her staff, so they understand. I mean, it is bringing that to just sending you a copy, or you're going to vote on it, or I think we just need to have an understanding of what that specifically means, so that or creating a policy around that's outside of these bylaws, however you want to do that. But I would be concerned that there may not be enough specificity about what that oversight means, because
Well,
you already have,
behind it.
that's already one of your duties, is to oversee.
Let's this, in terms of time, why don't we come back to that in terms of the policy, and whatever needs to do, adjust it into what in the bylaws we can do that. But that could be a pretty broad, extensive array of discussion around a litany of things. So rather than to rush through that and not get everything included in the sense of this very important motion, why don't we look at a policy that will develop all of those things consistent with what I think the intent of the motion is, that we get to the broader personnel, the budget, and all the other kinds of things that would be included therein.
Can I ask, Heidi, where is it implied that that's one of our duties?
I think just by, the creation of the board itself. I mean, you all are responsible for, I mean, the executive director has no authority other than what she's directed to do, or what you have delegated to her. So oversight of the budget, oversight of the staff, oversight of policies, processes, all of those things. Those are all things that have to be, she has to be directed to do. You are her boss, you have hired her, and you structure how these things occur. So I don't know that, I guess my point is you don't have to say that you have oversight of these things because you do. I think it's more important to say, or to spell out at some point, maybe not today, maybe not here. What does that mean so that you're giving a very clear directive to Rachel and her staff about what oversight looks like.
And that's what I'm suggesting, take the motion that we have, narrow it, and then come back and develop the policy around that so that it is fairly clear. Otherwise, we'll get into a long, exhaustive discussion about each one of those points, and this may not be the time to do that, but then we directed to come back, look at a policy statement that addresses all of that so that we're clear about it. Okay? So we're going to come back and look at that delegation and what we're clear about, including all the points that were made in the original motion.
Can I amend my motion?
Okay.
To just be number one, we hire the executive director, because I think when we get to the next section, it becomes important when we're saying these are it makes more sense when you say we hire the executive director, then the executive director hires all the staff and does all of these other things. So I think I'd like, if possible, to amend my whatever to say, number one, we hire the executive director, and number two, on at least an annually we review the AIB budget.
But I thought it was more than just the budget, though.
It is, but I feel like we can sort of flesh out some of those other things. But I feel like the budget is a big enough deal that it should be in the bylaws that we are reviewing it.
That we also in the bylaws that we are evaluating her and the budget, whatever.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Yes, that we are hiring and completing all human resources functions, including performance evaluation, salary adjustments, professional development of the executive director. And then number two, at least, on an annual basis, we review the budget.
Yeah. Okay. Did everybody understand that now? And we will come back to a broader policy statement on the other issues that I think was raised as well. But for the time being in the bylaws, this is what we reflect. Okay, there's second to the amended motion. I'll second. Okay, any further discussion on the motion as amended?
I have a question. Heidi,
Sure.
how would we write that in here? Because it's kind of confusing. If we're going down this line, A, B, C, D, E, is that going to be F? Is that going to be G? Or
I think the way it was articulated was sort of a G1 and G2. We can either do it that way or as a G and an H. And G, the first one be the hiring and evaluation of the executive director. And the second one would be the annual review of the AIB budget, the AIB operating budget.
so reviewing annually the AIB budget or whatever. Okay, so I don't know if that has to be part of it, but can we make those two separate statements? Like an F and a G?
Well, I think we had an F from Mr. Menko, so this will be a G and an H.
Oh, sorry, G and an H.
Sure, we can do that as a G and an H.
Thank you.
All right. With that clarification, any further comments or questions about the motion? If not, all in favor of the amendment, please indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposition? Hearing none, the motion carries. Now that's with the caveat that we will also come back and look at the broader policy statement that we need to develop as well. Okay. All right, let's go on.
Graham, if you could scroll down to section 5.2, thank you. So now we have the delegation of duties from the board to the executive director. So there are, I think, three, I'll have to look back down, main areas here: hiring permanent board staff pursuant to a staffing plan and hiring process adopted by the board, overseeing and managing board staff to fulfill the board's duties as set forth in law. And we'll get down to section 5.3, which talks about expenditures, but entering into contracts and agreements. If you could scroll down, Grant. Including grants interagency agreements in an amount not to exceed $25,000 necessary to carry out the day-to-day operations of the board and other duties that may be delegated by the board from time to time. So if you want to scroll back up, were there any questions? Just real quickly, sorry, Graham, thank you. On section 5.2?
Yes, the amounts, the 25,000 and so forth, is that some type of a standard amount? Or was that taken from other documents? Another document?
So this was actually not the amount, but this section 5.3, the expenditure of board funds, and this delegation was actually included in the MLDS bylaws that we use as a template. For their template, they had $10,000 as their delegation limit. And then they didn't have a middle sort of sphere. If we could scroll down to section 5.3 real quick, Graham, thank you. So here we have, I'll just go over this really quickly. These are your delegations for expenditure of board funds. Up to $25,000 is the executive director. Over $25,000, but less than 50, the chair can approve upon request from the executive director. For expenditures over $50,000 or $50,000 or more, I'm sorry, the executive director is required to obtain the approval of the board unless the executive director determines that there's an unanticipated or emergency expenditure that's needed over $50,000 or more that cannot wait. Then the executive director would take that to the chair, who can do one of three things: approve the expenditure, call a special meeting of the board to approve the expenditure, or defer that decision until the next scheduled board meeting. So this is what was drafted and recommended by your subcommittee. This looks exactly the same as MLDS, except for it was just it was up to $10,000 was delegated to the executive director, and anything above that had to go to the board.
Yeah, and let me just add that we had some back and forth on the limits. Some thought they should be less, some thought they should be more. So we sort of put these numbers in, I think, more or less as a placeholder, subject to, in order for the full board to discuss. I just didn't want anybody to think that,
I mean, $25,000 seems like a lot of sort of money to have like full discretion over. But I also understand that a lot of what we're doing is sort of contract, like it is sort of bigger dollar work. I'm wondering if there isn't a way to say any expenditures are subject to review by request of the board. So like, even if it was something that was like to keep it at 25,000, but if there was something that felt unusual, that we would be able to review it if it was less than that.
So my only question is I'm not sure if there would be prior notice to the board for under this, like you would need to specify that. So the board wouldn't know necessarily about something that was under $25,000 until the next meeting, where the executive director would explain that expenditure.
Let me back up 1 second. This may seem like a lot to some, but my world is relatively small. However, keep in mind what you've already done. You've stated that you're going to evaluate the executive director on her performance, including how they made expenditures, gave notice, and everything else. So there is an oversight that you have annually. But to believe that you go back and question every contract, you have the time and decision in advance would be pretty hard. But if we find that they have made decisions that upon our annual review that we don't agree with, and they've been irresponsible in that, then you can hold them responsible for that. But to do it on every contract at the point in time would be a huge challenge that I think would not be warranted. You may go back and forth about the amount, but there needs to be some level of flexibility. And again, you get an opportunity that if they're going out making these decisions on contracts of 25,000 or less, and we look at that in the annual review, then we don't agree with that, and that's something you dock them for. So they're not completely free in terms of their ability to do this without some level of oversight. You got the general oversight that comes back to evaluate this annually in any event. Now, I was not part of the committee that did this, so I'm just looking at it from a perspective outside that you still have that oversight. But to try to oversight on each and every decision, each and every time, and on an ongoing basis would end up being on a almost a daily basis, if you need be, disrupted. And this is something that you'd have to explain, because if you're going to make these expenditures and you got monthly meetings, then unless there's some real exception, then there would not be a need to do any of these things.
Hey, can I ask you a question, just because it seems like you would be the most familiar with this, and I'm not sure, but you know, for repeat contracts, right? You know, you have a relationship with an entity over the course of 3 months, and you re-up with them, you know, but each of these amounts is $25,000, and you just continue to re-up with them, or you contract with them for a different set of services. That's all. Those are looked at as all separate contracts, or those are those are, you know, those amounts cobbled together look like one large contract that probably should have had, you know, other levels of oversight. How does that dealt with?
Normally, those would be separate contracts, but if given your example, someone is awarding a contract repeated to the same vendor over and over again for a certain amount of money, then there needs to be some explanation of that in terms of the annual review. Why would you do this, and why would you not go out for a separate procurement? And then you also have to keep in mind that there are some state procurement requirements that you have to follow in any event. So it's a little difficult for you to just go completely AWOL on this section without some level of review and so forth. You're meeting monthly.
Yeah.
An annual review. You got to adhere to our procurement requirements in the state, and therefore you're going to get several looks at this. Person cannot go out and, like the congressman in, I think in New York, Santos, who went out and contracted for $1 below the appropriate amount. You see that in the review.
Yep.
To Joe's point, I wonder if there wouldn't be some value in having the executive director inform the board at each meeting of any contracts that have been executed at the 25,000 and under range.
Or really all, yeah, I
Yeah.
was gonna just say that as part of that budget update, that is
You could
executive
report
director, for me, to me, that would include any
reporting on, contracts.
contracts and agreements,
Yeah.
grants agreements, et cetera.
Well, Joe, I think you're raising a good point. And if we saw that there was a repeated 25,000 going to, we certainly would raise questions about that. And this would give it visibility.
So you got that on a monthly basis in the financial report, and you have the overall review at the end of the year. And it never stops a board member from asking questions in any of it.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, Mr. Chair. Just the board should know that they can always ask the executive director for any documents or any information that they need as board members to do their job at any time.
So Rachel, would it automatically in your financial report, do you give it, would you be giving a monthly financial report?
Yes.
And would
yes.
that include
now that we actually have access to our budget, we actually are starting to.
Would that include reporting on any contracts you had entered into?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any further questions on that matter?
Okay, so I just want to make sure we didn't have any questions on the previous section 5.2 because I jumped down quickly to the delegation section, section 5.2. Were there any questions on this section? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so we can scroll back down to 5.3, and I think the chair already asked if there were questions here, and hearing none, we will scroll down to the next section. Wait, can you just stop right there? So just real quickly on E and F of that section above, any document relating to expenditures exceeding $25,000 must be signed by the board chair. That goes with sort of that delegation. This might be the section that if you wanted to take this out or amend it, the executive director shall provide detailed information about expenditures over $25,000. If you want them on all of the expenditures,
Yes, yes,
then we would just amend this to remove F.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
I so
so
moved.
okay,
A second. All right, we're going to remove this so that it requires now all expenditures on the monthly report or as deemed to be needed. Any questions or comments about this section? Hearing none. All in favor of the motion, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposition? Hearing none. It now requires all expenditures on the report.
okay, and we're getting to the end. In Article 6, this is the last section of your bylaws. This is your non-discrimination equity statement. Were there any questions about this section?
Heidi, I don't have questions about this section, but I do have questions about things that are not in there. So I don't know if we want to just do this first and then go to the next, or.
Sure. So if there aren't any questions specifically about Article 6, Mr. Chair, with your permission, I would just entertain questions about items that are not included in the bylaws or any general questions.
Why don't you see?
Okay,
Yep.
So Dr. Lynch?
Lynch?
So I have a couple questions. One, there's no indemnification clause in here, and I don't know if we need it or if that's appropriate. So that's my first question.
Right. So your indemnity is covered under state law, but and I can certainly, if you'd like, at another meeting, come back and talk to you about what that includes.
Okay. And then my second question is just, and I don't know if it's here or if it's somewhere else, but there's nowhere sort of about that advancement of vote that we talked about before, you know, like are proxy votes allowed? What happens if there's a tie? You know, like just sort of the actual like voting and the process by which we follow, like, do we follow Robert's rules, or is there another legislative procedure that we follow? So I don't know, again, if that's here or if that's like a bylaw, if it's a policy issue, but sort of thinking about the actual process of the meetings.
So to answer some of those questions, and I think in order, so typically proxies, if they're not set forth in statute, that's not something that would generally be allowed. It's something that I can research and just make sure that if it's something that you all want me to take a look at, whether or not a proxy would be allowed, I can do that. But generally, that's not something that we see on state boards and commissions. Unless a designee is provided for. So oftentimes in statute, it'll say the state superintendent or his designee if he's on the board, but it does not usually provide for that for the public members. So I can take a look at that for you. In terms of, I'm sorry, your next question.
It's just like what happens if there's a tie? What happened? You know, are we following Robert's rule? Like, is there a procedure? Again, and I don't have a feeling about any of them. I just don't know if we need to have it spelled out somewhere.
So generally speaking, the state, if Robert's rules are not set forth as being your parliamentary procedure, either in statute or having you, if you don't adopt them specifically, then they do not apply. So you would need to adopt them specifically to have them apply. I don't generally see that because I think the boards typically enjoy having a little bit more discretion over their parliamentary procedure. I will say, typically, if there's a tie, then that motion wouldn't carry. You would need to have a majority for a motion to carry. So the motion would fail if there was a tie, just under general parliamentary procedure. But that's something that you all can address in your bylaws if you choose to do so. It just, the counterbalance to that is that you would lose any of that if you adopt sort of just like an overarching Robert's rules as opposed to sort of picking out the things that you like, then you're going to be subject to all of Robert's rules.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that. I just didn't know if we had to have that.
No, you don't. You don't. But if you would like
I'd
to
rather not read the Robert's Rules book again, but
right. If there are certain things that you would like to, think about and perhaps, add into the bylaws either now or as an amendment later, that's something that, you could definitely propose.
And then, thank you. And then my last question is just any sort of protection for board members or any AIB team member for individual rights that are generally associated with sort of political affiliations or whatever, sort of like your right to engage in all public, and I don't know if that's a policy or if that's a bylaw that provides that protection to people to engage in public civic engagement activities.
Sure. So state employees have that is in statute, their right to, to political engagement. I mean, there are some state employees who have particularly sensitive jobs who have more limited rights, but that the state employees themselves, those rights are set forth in law. I can check and see if there's a specific provision for, I think board members just would enjoy the same rights as any other citizen. And I don't think there's been any limitation on that, but I can definitely check and make sure that there hasn't been.
Any further questions?
I think that
Comments?
may be it.
I'm not going to call for a formal vote today because there are so many things that we need to go back and clear up to make sure we have the language clear and we get a cleaned up draft of this and that we propose final action on this for a later meeting because I want to make sure that everyone is satisfied with all of the moving parts that we've had today. So we're not going to formally adopt this today. We're going to simply give a sense of the body that what we've heard, subject to council's final wording of this, will come back at a later date and then we will formally adopt it. Are any questions or comments about this approach? Okay, and we'll hold up formal adoption of this, Madam Council, for a later date. And we'll hope to get a final draft with all of the changes and that we will add in a couple of areas where we think there should be a policy statement about board intent, and then we'll adopt the full matter at that point in time. Okay. Thank you so very much. We're running a little bit late on time. What are the matters, Rachel, that we need to probably adjust to and get to today on our agenda?
So you all have, and it's posted on the website, the draft hiring process and draft staffing plan that the bylaws refer to that in section 5.2. So those documents, you have those documents, the public has those documents. So in the interest of time, if you
To,
want to ask questions about it instead of walking through them, or bring questions at the next meeting, whatever the preference is, given the time. And then the other item on the agenda is just an update on.
why don't we have the update? We'll come back to the other matters at a later date.
Sure. So let me. Okay. So the update, the first point is the initial blueprint comprehensive plan. As you all know, is complete. It has been posted on the website. And we are getting printed copies of the plan. The initial order for printed copies is 1,000 copies. And we are putting together a distribution list that includes all of the stakeholders who've been involved in the process. And then we also want to make sure that we have some hard copies available for the general public. And so we may need to print more copies, but we started with 1,000. We should have those by mid next week. And the first copies, aside from the board members, will be going to the governors and the governor's office staff and the members of the General Assembly. The joint technical assistance sessions between MSDE and AIB to support the LEAs have been underway since mid-December. And we are continuing in those meetings this month in January. I've lost track of how many, but there are quite a few sessions in January, and then starting in February, there will be a joint session held with each LEA. And so all of these other TA sessions have been voluntary, but there is a requirement that each LEA bring a draft of their plan to a meeting with MSDE staff and AIB staff to review, to provide some feedback and answer questions. We're also holding weekly office hours where LEAs can request time. And just last night, we met with 4 different LEAs to answer questions and also get feedback. And so I think it's been very beneficial for all involved, including AIB and MSDE. And then we're proceeding with the outcome measures work group with Dr. Stapleton and Mr. Manco are working with AIB staff to develop a work plan for the work group, and also to review the applications. We received over 60 either applications or nominations for folks to serve on the outcome measures work group.
How many will be on that group, Rachel? Do we have a number in mind?
I think we're going for approximately like 14-ish.
Uh-huh.
But then when we have meetings to talk about specific pillar outcomes, that we would then incorporate the advisory groups for that pillar.
Good.
So the goal is to make the selections of the members and get a first meeting scheduled, in the next 3 to 4 weeks.
Will you, Joe and Laura make the selection?
That's a good question. Yeah, I
That's a
think
good question.
we are meeting, I think, in 11 minutes to talk about the names further. Some of them that we're talking about we're considering sort of ex officio members, given their role in education in the state of Maryland, that it's natural that there should be some people from MSDE, from MLDS, and then others are those who have been nominated or volunteered. But once we narrow down our names, I think it would be a good thing to vet that through the board.
The board. So right now, the next meeting of the board is tentatively February 9th. But perhaps this could be done not in a different way. So we didn't have to wait until February 9th.
Well, you could send them to the board members, let them get back if they have any thoughts or observations. I mean, it's up to Ike and the board, but I'm happy for you all to make the final decision. But I think it would be good for us to at least see the candidates.
The proposal.
I think in my mind, ideally, it would function similar to how we did the advisory committees, where the board would be presented with a slate of recommended candidates, and then it would have to, ideally be approved by the entire body. But, like Rachel said, that might mean in between now and February 9th, we would need to have, some kind of special session to vote, or maybe there's some kind of, other means for voting to get approval.
Well, if it's going to be approved by the board, then I think we ought to have a special meeting, because I don't think any of us wanted to wait till February 9th.
Correct.
Sorry about that. If it just added another meeting.
Well, we can certainly work on scheduling.
It probably wouldn't have to be a long meeting.
Right.
Okay, we'll try to schedule a meeting to get the recommended members together, approval, or at least to look at them.
Okay, and then the next item is the annual report, which we've talked about briefly, or a little bit here, touched on today. We did receive an extension on submitting the annual report until after the comprehensive plan was complete. Staff is working on a draft that we will obviously share with you and for review and comment before it is submitted to the governor and General Assembly. As Mr. Manko noted, and as we have talked about as part of the comprehensive plan development, the only recommendation that the AIB is making at this time to the legislature and the governor is to a technical correction to the full day pre-K formula to include 3 and 4-year-olds who receive special education services, English learners, and children experiencing homelessness into the funding formula so that they would be funded regardless of whether they meet the income eligibility requirement. So that was an oversight in the legislation because it gives a priority to these children who are not income eligible, but then they're not actually included in the funding formula, which clearly was not the intent. So that would be the only legislative recommendation at this point.
Yes. A question. A few meetings ago, we received the presentation on the recommendations from the English learner work group. Are we planning to take up discussion of those recommendations at some point as a board?
Yeah, we will. And there are quite a few others as well that have popped up. But I think consistent with what we've already adopted, that people who are seeking major legislative changes, and many of them are, that is not something that we're looking at for this session, but to the degree that we can accommodate all of the discussions and background information regarding other issues that we need to certainly go back and look at and There are several. We met, for example, Rachel and I yesterday with, who would we meet with? Yes, teachers.
The
And they had,
Maryland State Education Association Board.
yeah, and they had a whole list of items that they thought, and many of them were very sound, that they think we should look at and address. And as we've traveled around the state, last week we were in the Eastern Shore at the Mako conference, and the same thing as well. And so as we've gotten out, as the plan has been at least publicly displayed, we are getting additional comments, suggestions, and changes that are too numerous to mention at this point in time, but certainly some of the larger ones that we know we have to get back to, we certainly will do that.
And specifically on the English learners work group, a number of those recommendations were incorporated into the comprehensive plan, those that didn't require legislation. And so there are some that do require legislation, but many of them are already incorporated in the comprehensive plan. And since you noted that information, we also will be bringing the superintendent back to discuss, to finish his presentation from the last meeting on the neighborhood indicators of poverty report. The next, it was just yesterday was the first day of the legislative session. So 89 days to go. As a former legislative staffer, you start counting immediately. And next week, the chair and I are scheduled to give briefings to the Senate, now the Education, Environment, and Energy Committee. And then that's on Thursday, and on Friday is the a joint meeting of the House Appropriations and Ways and Means Committees. And we'll get the specific times, and if you're interested, the Senate meeting is in person, the House meeting is virtual.
Who's the new chair of that committee?
It's Senator Feldman is the chair of the in place of Senator Pinsky.
Yeah.
And then as I'm sure you all know, the governor will be inaugurated on next Wednesday, and the budget will be released or submitted by the governor to the General Assembly on Friday. And so at that point, we will have more information about the AIB's budget, as well as all of the blueprint funding in the budget. And then the last item I had for the update was the meeting schedule. So we had shared a draft schedule with you, and you know, already one of those dates is problematic. So I mentioned earlier that tentatively the next scheduled meeting would be February 9th. Another question is the start time. In the past, we've started at 1. This meeting, we started at 1:30. I think for scheduling purposes, with session and budget hearings and bill hearings and briefings that all start at 1 o'clock, at least for the meetings during session, I would suggest maybe we start later, like at 3 o'clock, but that might be too late for you all, depending on how long the meetings are going to go. But that would allow for, you know, if folks who we need to come to our meetings have something at 1, which is typically when they would have it, they would still be able to be on our agenda. But for the next meeting, February 9th, and if you all can just let me know if that's going to work for you. And I think, Mr. Vice Chair, is 3 o'clock the time you would need?
Yeah. If you start earlier, I'll have to drop off for just a little bit and come back, but I'm free at 3. But if you need to start earlier, I'll just
Right.
exit for a period of time and come back.
Okay. Okay. All right. So we'll finalize the time for the next meeting. And then we'll work on finding a special meeting time. And maybe we'll work on that. Maybe we could also, it might need to be a little longer, and we could start talking about the hiring process and the staffing plan so that we can move forward on that.
Okay,
And that's
Question.
all, that's everything I have.
all right. Any further questions from the board members? Okay, let's have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
A second, moved and properly seconded, we adjourn. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. And the ayes have it. Thank you.
Okay, good meeting.